east of the airbase were three objects that can best be described as three half-sized suns. By the time I arrived at base operations, there were 3 or 4 dozen people on the ramp, all looking up. The standard comment was, "Look at them go!" About this time, a C-54 transport taxied up and stopped. It was the Kitty Hawk flight from Washington, and I knew several people who got off. One passenger, an officer from ATIC, ran up to me and handed me a roll of film. "Here's some pictures of them," he said breathlessly. "I never thought I'd see one." The next passengers I recognized were 2 other officers, PhD psychologists from the Aero Medical Laboratory. I knew them because they had visited Blue Book many times, collecting data for a paper they were writing on UFOs. The title of the paper was to be "The Psychological Aspects of UFO Sightings." Almost climbing over each other in their effort to tell their story, they told me how they had watched the UFOs from the C-54. Both had seen them dogfighting between themselves. "How fast were they going?" I asked. "Like hell," was their only answer, but the way they said it and the looks on their faces emphasized their statement. The crowd on the ramp had increased by now, and some of the newcomers had binoculars. The men with the binoculars were the focal point of several individual groups as they watched and gave blow-by-blow accounts. Some of the crowd were talking about jet fighters, and it suddenly dawned on me that just across the parking lot was the operations office of the local ADC jet outfit, the 97th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. I ran over to Interceptor Operations and went in. I knew the duty officer because several times before, the 97th people had chased balloons over Dayton. When I told him about the UFOs, all I received was a rather uninterested stare. When I said they were over the base, he did me the courtesy of going out to look. He came running back in and hit the scramble button. 3 minutes later, 2 F-86s were heading UFO-ward. They soon disappeared, but their vapor trails kept the tense crowd informed of their progress. And believe me, there was tension. As the vapor trail spiraled up, first as 2 distinct plumes, and later only one as they blended at altitude, more than one pilot standing on the ramp expressed his thankfulness for his unenviable position, on the ground, watching. The vapor trails thinned out and disappeared right under the 3 UFOs, and it was obvious that the 2 jets had closed in. Here were 3 that didn't escape. That night, the 97th Fighter Interceptor Squadron added 3 more balloons to their record. The F-86s had been able to climb higher than the F-84s. The next morning, photos confirmed the balloons. They had been tethered together and carried an instrument package. I had been fooled. 2 PhD psychologists who had studied UFOs had been fooled. A C-54 load of experienced observers, many pilots, had been fooled. The tower operators had been fooled, and so had 100 others. This was an interesting sighting, and we used to discuss it a lot. All of the observers later agreed that what made them so excited was the tower operators' announcement, "F-84s from Lockbourne are chasing 3 high-speed objects." This set the stage, and from then on, no one even considered the fact that if the objects had been traveling 2,000 or 3,000 miles an hour, they would have been long gone in the 15 minutes we watched them. Secondly, I found out that the C-54 and passed the balloons between Columbus and Dayton, but none of the passengers I talked to had stopped to think of this. And I'm positive that in our minds, the balloons, which were about 40 feet in diameter and at 40,000 feet, looked a lot larger than they actually were. I know the power of suggestion plays an important role in UFO sightings. Once you're convinced you're looking at a UFO, you can see a lot of things. But then there's the unknowns. Any good saucer fan, wild-eyed or sober, will magnanimously concede that a certain percentage of the UFO sightings are the misidentification of known objects. They drag out the unknowns as the proof. Technically speaking, an unknown report is one that has been made by a reliable observer, not necessarily experienced. The report has been exhaustively investigated and analyzed, and there is no logical explanation. To this, the Air Force says, "The Air Force emphasizes the belief that if more immediate, detailed, objective observational data could have been obtained on the unknowns, these too could have been satisfactorily explained." I think the case of the Lubbock Lights is an excellent example of this. It is probably one of the most thoroughly investigated reports in the UFO files, and it contained the most precise observational data we ever received. Scientists from far and near tried to solve it. It remained an unknown. The men who made the original sightings stuck by the case and furnished the more detailed objective observational data the Air Force speaks of. The mysterious lights appeared again, and instead of looking for something high in the air, they looked for something low and found the solution. The world-famous Lubbock Lights were night-flying moths reflecting the bluish-green light of a nearby row of mercury vapor streetlights. I will go a step further than the Air Force, however, and quote from a letter from ex-Lieutenant Andy Flues, once an investigator for Project Blue Book. Flues' statement sums up my beliefs, and I'm quite sure the beliefs of everyone who has ever worked on projects Sign, Grudge, or Blue Book. Flues wrote, "Even taking into consideration the highly qualified backgrounds of some of the people who made sightings, there was not one single case which, upon the closest analysis, could not be logically explained in terms of some common object or phenomena. The only reason there are any unknowns in the UFO files is that an effort is made to be scientific in making evaluations. And being scientific doesn't allow for any educated assuming of missing data or the passing of judgment on the character of the observer. However, this is closely akin to being forced to follow the Marquis of Queensberry rules in a fight with a hood. The investigation of any UFO sighting is an inexact science at the very best. Any UFO investigator, after a few months of being steeped in UFO lore and allowed a few scientific rabbit punches, can make the best of the unknowns look like a piece of well-holed Swiss cheese. But regardless of what I say, or what the Air Force says, or what anyone says, we are stuck with flying saucers. And as long as people report unidentified objects in the air, it's the Air Force's responsibility to explain them. Project Blue Book will live on. No responsible scientist will argue with the fact that other solar systems may be inhabited, and that someday we may meet those people. But it hasn't happened yet, and until that day comes, we're stuck with our space-age myth, the UFO. End of Chapter 20. Recording by Roger Moline. End of The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppel.
Section 0 of the Roswell Report, Case Closed by James McAndrew. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Aaron Bennett. The Roswell Report, Case Closed by James McAndrew. Foreword, Guide for Readers, and Introduction. Foreword. The Roswell incident has assumed a central place in American folklore since the events of the 1940s in a remote area of New Mexico. Because the Air Force was a major player in those events, we have played a key role in executing the General Accounting Office's tasking to uncover all records regarding that incident. Our objective throughout this inquiry has been simple and consistent: to find all the facts and bring them to light. If documents were classified, declassify them. Where they were dispersed, bring them into a single source for public review. In July 1994, we completed the first step in that effort and later published the Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. This volume represents the necessary follow-on to that first publication and contains additional material and analysis. I think that with this publication we have reached our goal of a complete and open explanation of the events that occurred in the Southwest many years ago. Beyond that achievement, this inquiry has shed fascinating light into the Air Force of that era and revitalized our appreciation for the dedication and accomplishments of the men and women of that time. As we celebrate the Air Force's 50th anniversary, it is appropriate to once again reflect on the sacrifices made by so many to make ours the finest air and space force in history. Sheila E. Widnall, Secretary of the Air Force. Guide for Readers. This publication contains the complete report as submitted to the Secretary of the Air Force. Appendix B. Due to Privacy Act restrictions and by request, the addresses of the individuals making these statements have been deleted. This volume is divided into 2 sections, 8 subsections, 11 sidebar discussions, and 3 appendices. Section 1 examines alleged events at 2 locations in rural New Mexico. Section 2 examines the alleged activities at the Roswell Army Airfield Hospital. Appendix A is a table listing the launch and landing locations of test equipment for U.S. Air Force scientific research projects High Dive and Excelsior. Appendix B is a collection of signed sworn statements based on in-person interviews conducted for this report by U.S. Air Force researchers. The exception is the statement of Lieutenant Colonel William C. Kaufman, which was not sworn due to equipment failures at the time of interview. Appendix C contains transcripts of interviews of alleged witnesses presented by UFO theorists. The interviews of Gerald Anderson, Alice Knight, and Vern Maltese were excerpted in their entirety from unedited interviews used to prepare the video Recollections of Roswell, Part 2, 1993, and appear courtesy of the Fund for UFO Research. The interview of Mr. W. Glenn Dennis was provided by the interviewer, Carl T. Flock. The transcript of the interview of Mr. James Ragsdale was provided by Kevin Randall, the co-author of The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, Avon Books 1994, in which direct quotes from this transcript appear. A selected bibliography of technical reports and how to obtain them are found on page 221. For additional information on this subject, see Headquarters United States Air Force, The Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert, Washington, D.C., U.S. Government Printing Office, 1995. Introduction. In July 1994, the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force concluded an exhaustive search for records in response to a General Accounting Office, GAO, inquiry of an event popularly known as the Roswell Incident. The focus of the GAO probe, initiated at the request of New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff, was to determine if the U.S. Air Force or any other U.S. government agency possessed information on the alleged crash and recovery of an extraterrestrial vehicle